A teenage boy reached across the table and slapped a disabled woman's milkshake straight onto the floor, then laughed. Not one person in that diner moved. Not one person said a word, except him. A mechanic, a single dad, a man who had nothing to prove and everything to lose. And he stood up anyway. What happened next didn't just silence two bullies. It changed two lives forever. This is the story of Evelyn Ward and Daniel Carter, and the 30 seconds that started it all. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this one hits you, subscribe, because we're just getting started. The milkshake hit the floor before Evelyn even saw it coming. 1 second it was in her hand, cold, sweet, the one small comfort she'd allowed herself on a brutal November morning. The next second, it was gone. Strawberry ice cream spread slowly across the black and white tile of Rusty's diner, like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. And the boy who'd done it? He was still laughing. Oops! That was the word he used. Oops! Like he'd bumped into a stranger's elbow. Like what he'd done was an accident. Like the woman sitting across from him, the woman gripping her crutches with white knuckles and refusing to cry, was nothing more than an inconvenience he'd stumbled into. Evelyn Ward did not cry. She hadn't cried in public since she was 9 years old, the first time a kid on the school bus called her Gimpy. She'd cried that night in her bedroom, face buried in her pillow so her mother wouldn't hear. And when she was done, she'd made herself a promise. Never again in front of them. Whoever them was, bullies, strangers, boardroom executives who underestimated her, she would never give them the satisfaction. So she didn't cry now. She looked down at the ruined milkshake. She looked at her crutches leaning against the wall beside her booth. And then she looked up at the two boys standing over her table like they owned the whole diner and everything in it. They were 17, maybe 18. One was tall with a red baseball cap pulled low. The other was stocky, thick-armed, wearing a smirk that had probably never been challenged a day in his life. His name, she would later learn, was Kyle Marsh. The kind of boy who'd grown up being told he was funny when he was cruel. "You gonna clean that up?" Kyle said. He nodded down at the spreading puddle of pink ice cream on the floor. Evelyn's jaw was tight. Her voice, when she found it, was completely flat. "Walk away." "Excuse me?" He tilted his head like she'd said something ridiculous. "Did you just—" "I said, walk away." The tall one, his friend, laughed nervously. Something flickered in his eyes, some distant cousin of shame. But he didn't move. Boys like him never moved on their own. They waited to see which way the wind was blowing. Kyle leaned forward, one hand flat on the table, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Too much of it, the kind teenage boys sprayed on like armor. "You know what your problem is?" he said. "You think just 'cause you got those—" He flicked a finger toward her crutches. "Everybody's supposed to feel sorry for you. You sit in here all by yourself, taking up a whole booth." "Kyle." His friend's voice was low, a warning. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." "No," Evelyn said. "You're saying what you're thinking, which tells me everything I need to know about you." Something shifted in Kyle's face. The smirk dropped. Not because he felt shame, not yet, but because no one talked to him like that. Certainly not a woman sitting alone with a pair of crutches and a ruined milkshake at her feet. He opened his mouth, and that was when the chair scraped. It came from across the diner, a single, deliberate sound. The kind of sound that cuts through everything. Conversation, background noise, the hiss of the coffee machine. All of it went quiet for just a moment as a man in the corner booth stood up. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't knock anything over. He just stood, slowly, like a man who'd made a decision and had no intention of walking it back. He was maybe 32, 33. Work boots, worn at the toe. Dark jeans with a faint oil stain near the knee. A gray Henley shirt pushed up to the elbows despite the cold outside. His hands were the hands of someone who worked for a living. Calloused palms, a small scar on the left knuckle that had healed wrong. He wasn't big in the way that intimidates. He wasn't the kind of man who filled the room with muscle or volume. But there was something in the way he moved across that diner. Unhurried, deliberate, completely certain of each step, that made every person in the room watch him without meaning to. His name was Daniel Carter, and he had been sitting in that corner booth for 40 minutes, nursing his second cup of coffee and trying to read a car parts catalog when the boys had first started in on the woman across the room. He'd noticed her when he sat down. He noticed most people. It was a habit he'd built over years of working in close quarters, of sizing up situations before they became problems. She'd come in alone, maneuvering through the door with practiced efficiency, sliding into the booth with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned to move through a world that wasn't built for her. She'd ordered a milkshake and a plate of eggs, and she'd been reading something on her phone, and Daniel had gone back to his catalog. He'd told himself it wasn't his business. He'd told himself that 3 times, actually, as the boys circled her table like gulls around a dropped sandwich. Once when the first comment came. Once when they knocked the milkshake over. Once when the stocky one leaned across the table and pointed at her crutches. 3 times. And then he stood up. Hey. 1 word. Quiet. No anger in it. Not yet. Just a word that landed in the space between the boys and the woman, like a stone dropped into still water. Kyle turned around slowly, the way boys do when they want to communicate that they're not scared. What? Daniel stopped at the edge of the table. He looked at Kyle for a long moment without saying anything. Just looked. The way a man looks at a situation he's trying to fully understand before he speaks. What's your name? He asked. Kyle blinked. That was clearly not what he'd expected. What? Your name. Daniel's voice was patient, almost polite. I'm asking your name. Why does that? Because I'd like to know the name of the person I'm talking to. A beat. That's how it works. The tall friend shifted his weight. Kyle's jaw worked. Kyle, he finally said. Kyle. Daniel nodded. I'm Daniel, and I'm going to need you and your friend to apologize to this woman and then leave. A half laugh from Kyle. You're serious right now? Completely. Man, you don't even know what happened. You were sitting over there minding your own. I know exactly what happened. Daniel's voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen. It stayed level in a way that was somehow more unsettling than shouting. I've been sitting 20 feet away for the last 10 minutes. I heard everything you said. I watched you knock her drink on the floor on purpose. So yeah, I know what happened. Silence. Kyle's smirk flickered. Not gone. Not yet. But something uncertain moving underneath it. So what, you're like a hero now? Coming over here to save the day? I'm not a hero, Daniel said simply. I'm a man who's not going to sit in a diner and watch somebody get treated like that. He paused. You want to talk about what kind of man that makes you? We can do that. But first, you're going to apologize. I don't have to apologize to anybody. The word came out of Daniel's mouth before Kyle had even finished his sentence. Quiet, final, immovable. Yeah, he said. You do. Something happened to Kyle Marsh in that moment that he would not have been able to explain. Later, weeks later, when the story had gotten around and someone asked him about it, he would say that the man hadn't threatened him, hadn't called him names or gotten in his face, hadn't done any of the things you'd expect from a confrontation like that. He'd just looked at him. like he could see all the way down through the performance and the swagger and the borrowed confidence, straight to the part of Kyle that knew, had always known, that what he was doing was wrong. It was the tall friend who broke first. "Kyle," he said, quietly. "Come on, man. Just shut up, Marcus." But Marcus was already turning toward the woman's booth. His face was red, his eyes fixed somewhere around his own shoes. "I'm sorry," he said, to the table more than to her. I'm sorry." Kyle stood very still. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. The silence stretched for 5 full seconds. 10. And then Kyle's smirk died completely, like a candle running out of wick. And what was left underneath was just a 17-year-old kid who was embarrassed and tired, and not nearly as hard as he needed everyone to believe. "Sorry," he said, barely audible, directed at the floor. "But there." "To her," Daniel said quietly. Kyle's jaw tightened. Then he looked up, met the woman's eyes for exactly 1 second. "Sorry," he said again. She didn't say anything. She just held his gaze until he looked away. They left. The bell above the door jingled twice, and they were gone, and the diner exhaled. Coffee mugs went back to lips. Silverware started moving again. Somewhere near the counter, an older man in a flannel jacket said, to no one in particular, "Well, about time." Evelyn sat very still for a moment. Her hands were in her lap, beneath the table, where no one could see that they were shaking. Not from fear. She needed to be clear about that, at least to herself. She didn't shake from fear. She shook from the effort of holding everything in. The way you shake after you've been gripping something too tightly for too long, and you finally let go. The waitress appeared beside her, a heavy-set woman in her 50s, with dyed red hair and the expression of someone who had seen most of what the world had to offer and remained largely unimpressed. She set down a fresh milkshake without a word. "Strawberry, same as before." "On the house, honey," she said, and then she was gone. Evelyn looked at the milkshake. She pressed her lips together. She did not cry. Daniel was still standing at the edge of her booth. He was pulling a few napkins from the dispenser on the table, crouching down without being asked, cleaning up the mess on the floor with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who was used to cleaning up other people's messes. When he stood back up, he deposited the napkins in the nearest trash bin, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked at her with an expression that was somehow neither pitying nor proud, just present. "You okay?" he asked. 2 words, the most ordinary question in the world, and for reasons she would not entirely understand until later, until she was sitting in the back of her car on the way to the office, staring out at the gray November street and thinking about what had happened. Those 2 words hit her harder than anything else from that morning. Not, "I'm sorry that happened." Not, "Those kids were awful." Not the performative concern of someone who wanted credit for noticing. Just, "You okay?" "I'm fine," she said. And then, because it was true, and because this man had stood up and walked across a room for a stranger, and deserved at least honesty in return, "I've had worse." He nodded, like that made sense. "Mind if I—" He gestured toward the other side of the booth. She looked at him for a moment. Evelyn Ward did not, as a rule, invite strangers to sit with her. She did not, as a rule, make small talk in diners or exchange pleasantries with people she didn't know and would likely never see again. She had an office. She had a schedule. She had a car waiting outside and a 9 a.m. call that she was going to be 12 minutes late for if she didn't leave in the next 7. "Sure," she said. His coffee arrived without him asking for it. The waitress, apparently, had decided on his behalf. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the window at the street for a moment, quiet in the comfortable way of someone who wasn't looking to fill silence with noise. Evelyn found herself studying him in the way she studied everyone, cataloging, assessing, filing information without appearing to do it. It was how she'd survived 41 years of boardrooms and negotiations and men who'd looked at her crutches and decided she was a liability. He wasn't performing. That was the first thing she noticed, and the thing she noticed most. He hadn't come over here to be seen doing a good thing. There was no audience he was playing to. He'd just stood up and dealt with a situation that needed dealing with, and now he was sitting across from a stranger drinking coffee and not asking for anything. "You do that a lot?" she asked. He looked at her, a small question on his face. "Step in," she said, "when it's not your business." He thought about it, really thought, which was not what she'd expected. Most people's answer to that kind of question was reflexive. "I just couldn't stand by," or "somebody had to." The small, heroic narrative people put around themselves. He sat with it for a moment before he answered. "My kid's 8, he said. "I think about the world she's going to grow up in. What I want her to see men do when things go wrong." A slight shrug. "I guess that factors in." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "You have a daughter?" "Sophie, yeah." Something moved across his face. Warmth, automatic and unguarded, the way parents' faces change when they talk about their children. "She'd have wanted me to do something. Honestly, I was more scared of her finding out I didn't than I was of those kids." Evelyn almost smiled. It startled her. "How old are you?" 33. "Where do you work?" He raised an eyebrow slightly at the directness. "Carter's Auto, shop on Meridian, near the old post office. I run it. It was my dad's." "How long?" 5 years, since he had his stroke." She nodded, the kind of nod that meant, "I see." She glanced down at his hands, the scarred knuckles, the calluses, hands that matched the story. She'd spent enough time shaking the hands of men who called themselves builders and entrepreneurs and self-made to know the difference between the ones who meant it and the ones who wore it like a costume. "I'm Evelyn," she said. "Daniel." He offered his hand across the table. She shook it. She was 10 minutes late to her 9 a.m. call. Margaret, her assistant, had already sent 2 texts and left 1 voicemail by the time Evelyn settled into the back seat of the car, the new milkshake in a takeout cup in her hand. She looked at the texts. She looked at the voicemail notification. She put the phone face down on the seat beside her and looked out the window. The city was gray and cold and full of people moving fast with their heads down, the way people do in November when the wind has an edge to it and the sky can't decide if it wants to commit to rain. She thought about Daniel Carter sitting across from her in that booth, the way he'd talked about his daughter. "I was more scared of her finding out I didn't." She thought about the moment he'd stood up, the sound of that chair scraping, the way the whole diner had gone quiet around it. She thought about herself at 9 years old, face in a pillow, making a promise. She thought about how she'd sat in that booth for 10 full minutes while those boys circled her, and not one person in that diner had moved. Not the waitress behind the counter, not the old man in the flannel jacket who'd spoken up after the fact. Not the couple in the window booth who'd looked away when Kyle knocked the milkshake over. Not one person. Until him. She picked her phone back up, pulled up Margaret's number. "I know," she said when Margaret answered, before Margaret could speak. "Reschedule the 9 o'clock to 10:30. A pause. "And pull everything we have on a business called Carter's Auto on Meridian Street." Another pause. "No, don't tell me why yet. Just pull it." She hung up. The car moved through the gray city streets. Evelyn watched the buildings pass, the ones her company owned, the ones she was in the process of acquiring, the ones she'd been watching for 3 years, waiting for the right moment. 14 years of building Ward Industries from a single commercial property into a portfolio worth $400 million. 14 years of being the woman in the room who had to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously, who had to fight for every inch of credibility in a world that looked at her crutches before it looked at her face. She knew what it cost to build something. She thought she was beginning to understand what it cost to protect something, a business, a community, a daughter's idea of who her father was. She looked down at the takeout cup in her hand. Strawberry milkshake. A small gift from a waitress who'd seen what happened and wanted to do something, even if it was only this. On the house, hummy. The smallest gestures. She thought about that, about how much the small ones cost the people who gave them, and how much they weighed on the people who received them. The mechanic standing up, the waitress and the milkshake, the daughter who didn't even know she'd had anything to do with it. Evelyn Ward had spent 14 years building something enormous. She wondered, for the first time in a long while, if enormous was the right thing to be building. She didn't go back to Rusty's diner the next day. She went back the day after that, on a Thursday morning, because Thursday was when she didn't have a standing meeting before 11, and she had always, before the years got away from her, been a person who ate breakfast sitting down. She ordered eggs and coffee, and she read through a property assessment on her phone, and she did not look for Daniel Carter, and she did not allow herself to be disappointed that he wasn't there. On Friday, he was. Same corner booth, same car parts catalog, same 2 cups of coffee, the second arriving before the first was finished. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face registered recognition. Not surprise, just acknowledgement. The way you acknowledge someone you filed away as worth paying attention to. She crossed the diner and stopped at the edge of his booth. "You're in my seat," she said. He looked at her, then slowly, a small smile. "There are 11 other booths." "I know." She didn't move. He slid the catalog over and nodded at the seat across from him. She sat down. They talked for 50 minutes that morning. About the diner. It had been open since 1987, she told him. The original owner's granddaughter ran it now. About Sophie. She was in 3rd grade, loved horses, had recently decided she wanted to be a marine biologist, which Daniel said changed every 3 weeks. About the garage. It had 12 bays, specialized in domestic vehicles, had been his father's whole life, and now was becoming his. About Ward Industries. She told him less than she usually said, and more than she meant to, which told her something about him, even if she wasn't sure yet what. "What happened to you?" he asked at one point. He glanced briefly, carefully, at the crutches leaning against the side of the booth. Not the look she was used to, not pitying, not awkward, not the exaggerated effort to avoid looking that was somehow worse than looking. Just a question, from someone who wanted to understand. She considered him for a moment. "Car accident," she said. 22 years ago. I was 19. A pause. The other driver was drunk and walked away without a scratch. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be. It made me who I am." She said it without performance. It was simply true, the way facts are true, and she'd made her peace with it the way you make peace with the things you can't change. "I just don't always enjoy the way people respond to who I am." He nodded, that same real, considered nod, like he was actually filing what she said, rather than just waiting to respond. "The boys," she said. "Tuesday morning. You didn't hesitate." "I hesitated," he said. "I hesitated for about 10 minutes. "But you stood up." "Yeah." He looked down at his coffee. Eventually.
That's the part that matters.
He looked up at her then, and she held his gaze with the same steadiness she'd held Kyle Marsh's gaze 3 days before. But differently. Not as a challenge, as something else. As recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement between two people who have both spent significant time understanding what it costs to do the hard thing, and do it anyway. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think you might be right." Outside, the November sky had finally committed to rain. It came down against the diner windows in slow, diagonal lines, turning the street to dark glass. Inside, the coffee machine hissed. The old man in the flannel jacket was back at the counter. Apparently irregular, like both of them, which Evelyn found quietly amusing. She looked at her phone. 10:47 a.m. She had a meeting at 11. She didn't move. "Tell me about the garage," she said. And Daniel Carter looked at her for a moment, like he was trying to decide what kind of question that really was. Then he told her. She didn't know yet what she was setting in motion. She didn't know about the property. She didn't know about the offer that had been sitting on her acquisition director's desk for 6 weeks, unsigned. She didn't know that the building Carter's Auto occupied was on a block she'd had her eye on for 2 years, part of a redevelopment plan that would have raised the garage and replaced it with a mixed-use complex that looked good on paper and meant nothing to anyone who lived there. She didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that the rain was coming down outside, and her coffee was warm, and the man across from her was talking about a 1967 Mustang that had come into the shop last week. A father-son restoration project, the son barely older than Sophie. And his face had the look of a man describing something that matters to him in ways he doesn't have the words for yet. She knew what that looked like. She saw it in the mirror every morning. And Evelyn Ward, who had not allowed herself to be surprised by a person in a very long time, found herself thinking, "I did not expect you." Margaret had pulled the file on Carter's Auto by noon. It was sitting on Evelyn's desk when she got back to the office. A slim folder, maybe 12 pages. The kind of preliminary assessment her acquisition team put together in a few hours when she asked for something quickly. Property records, business registration, tax history, a Google Maps screenshot of the block. She didn't open it right away. She hung her coat, got rid of the takeout coffee cup, answered 3 emails that couldn't wait, and then sat down and looked at the folder with her hands folded on top of it for a long moment. Margaret appeared in the doorway. She was 28, sharp, and had worked for Evelyn long enough to know that some questions you asked, and some you didn't. "The Meridian Block Assessment," Evelyn said. "Pull that too." Margaret nodded and was gone. Evelyn opened the Carter's Auto file. The building was a 1940s-era commercial structure, 12 bays, just under 8,000 square feet on the ground floor, with a small office and storage mezzanine above. Owned outright, no mortgage, deed transferred to a Daniel J. Carter 5 years ago, following the death of one Robert L. Carter, the original proprietor. The business had been operating continuously since 1971. 14 employees. Annual revenue modest but consistent, trending slightly upward over the past 2 years. She read that last part twice. Trending upward, quietly, without fanfare, the way real things grew. She turned to the property record, and there it was, the thing she'd half suspected since she'd asked Margaret to pull the file. The thing that sat in the back of her mind like a splinter she hadn't quite located yet. The Meridian Block. One of 3 commercial parcels her development director, a precise man named Grant Holloway, had flagged as priority targets in the East Side Corridor Plan. Mixed-use redevelopment, Retail on the ground floor, residential above. Clean, profitable, and she saw it now with a clarity that made something in her chest tighten, completely indifferent to what was already there. Carter's Auto was on the list. Not the top of it. Not yet. But it was there. A quiet line item in a document she'd approved 8 months ago without blinking. Because 8 months ago, she hadn't walked into a diner on a November morning and watched a man stand up and walk across a room when nobody else would. She closed the folder. She picked up her phone and called Holloway. "The Meridian Corridor," she said when he answered. "The Carter's Auto property. Where are we on that?" A pause, the soft sound of papers moving. "We sent a preliminary inquiry letter in September. No response. I was going to follow up next quarter, after we close the Fenwick acquisition. Put it on hold." Another pause. Longer this time. "Evelyn, that block is central to the—" "I know what it's central to, Grant. Put it on hold." A beat. "I want to look at some alternative configurations before we go further." She hung up before he could ask why. She sat there for a moment, her hands still on the phone, and thought about a man in work boots with oil on his jeans, talking about a 1967 Mustang restoration project, while the rain came down outside. She thought about a girl named Sophie, who wanted to be a marine biologist, and changed her mind every 3 weeks. She thought about a business that had been in operation since 1971, before Evelyn was born, before she'd taken her first step or her last certain one, and was still running because a man had decided to stand where his father stood, and keep standing. She didn't know what she was going to do with any of that yet, but she knew she wasn't going to knock it down. The Meridian block file arrived on her desk 20 minutes later. She read it cover to cover, made 4 margin notes, and then called her assistant back in. "Get me a meeting with Thomas Reeves," she said. Thomas was her chief of urban development, the one who'd designed the East Side Corridor plan from the ground up. "Not this week, next Tuesday. And tell him I want to talk about flexibility in the commercial preservation tier." Margaret wrote it down without commenting. She was very good at her job. "And Margaret," Evelyn looked up, "what do we know about small business development grants in this district? City level? State level? What's available?" Margaret blinked once. "I'll find out." "Thank you." When she was alone again, Evelyn turned her chair toward the window. 12 stories up, the city spread out below her in all its gray November indifference. Cranes and parking structures, and the flat ribbons of streets carrying people who had no idea her office existed, who had no idea any of this existed, who were just trying to get somewhere warm. She thought about what Daniel had said that morning. Not the part about the garage, though she'd stored all of that carefully. The part about Sophie. "I think about the world she's going to grow up in. What I want her to see men do when things go wrong." Evelyn had never had children. She'd thought about it, in the distant, complicated way you think about things that the life you chose made difficult. She didn't regret the life she chose, but she understood, looking out at the city now, what Daniel meant. The desire to leave something worth living in. Not a building, not a portfolio. Something worth living in. She hadn't thought about her work that way in a long time. She wasn't sure when she'd stopped. She turned back to her desk, pulled out a clean legal pad, and wrote 2 words at the top. "What remains?" Then she stared at them for a while, and began to think. Daniel didn't know any of this, of course. He knew that he'd had a strange Tuesday and a stranger Thursday, and that the woman from the diner had come back on Friday and sat across from him for nearly an hour and asked him questions that were too smart and too specific to be casual. He knew that she'd listened to him the way people listened when they were actually listening, not waiting, not half distracted, not formulating their response while you were still in the middle of yours. Actually listening. Filing. The way you did when something mattered. He knew her name now. Evelyn Ward. He'd looked it up Friday night after he got home, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open while Sophie slept down the hall. It hadn't taken long. Ward Industries was not a secret. $400 million in commercial real estate holdings across 3 states. Named to Forbes' list of most influential business people in the region 2 years running. A profile in a business magazine from last year. Evelyn in a formal blazer, leaning slightly on one crutch, meeting the camera with an expression that wasn't exactly a smile, but wasn't exactly not one either. He'd sat there looking at the screen for a long time. Then he'd closed the laptop and gone to bed. And in the morning, he'd made Sophie's lunch and driven her to school, and gone to the shop and slid under a 2019 F-150 with a transmission issue. And he told himself that, whatever that woman's reason for being at Rusty's diner twice a week, it had nothing to do with him. He told himself that right up until she walked in again the following Tuesday. He watched her come through the door, the same practiced efficiency, the same forward momentum, the crutches moving in rhythm with her steps like an extension of her own intent rather than an accommodation. She spotted him in the corner without looking for him, which meant she'd been looking for him, and she crossed the diner and stopped at the edge of his booth. "You looked me up," she said. Not a question. He didn't bother denying it. "You're not hard to find." She sat down. "What did you think?" "I thought you were a lot more than someone who comes to diners for breakfast." "I come to diners for breakfast because I built a company for 14 years, and I've spent most of them eating at my desk." She picked up the menu without opening it. "I decided to stop doing that." "How long ago did you decide that?" She put the menu down. 3 weeks ago." He looked at her. "So just before Tuesday, yes." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm not going to pretend that's a coincidence. It isn't." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug a quarter turn in his hand. "What do you want, Evelyn?" She appreciated that, the directness. She gave it back. "I want to talk about your building," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not alarm, not quite. More like the look of a man who has just heard a word he didn't know to expect, but recognized it immediately. "My building." "Carter's Auto, the property on Meridian." The coffee mug stopped turning. "You know about it." "I know about it," she said. "I should tell you, my company sent you a letter in September, a preliminary inquiry. You didn't respond." He was very still. "That letter was from your company." "From my development division, under a subsidiary name." A pause. "I didn't know about you specifically when it was sent. I want to be clear about that." He looked at her for a long time. She let him. She'd learned, in 14 years of negotiations, that the impulse to fill silence was almost always a mistake. "What was in the letter?" he asked finally. "An expression of interest in acquiring the property. For redevelopment." Redevelopment. He said the word like he was tasting it. "Meaning, you want to knock it down?" "Meaning, that was the plan," Evelyn said. 8 months ago, before I knew anything other than an address and a square footage." "And now?" She looked at him directly. "Now I've put the acquisition on hold. I'm looking at alternative approaches, ways to develop the corridor that don't require removing the existing businesses." "Why?" No performance in it, just the honest question. "Because I looked at the file," she said. "Your father opened that garage in 1971. You've had 14 employees for 3 years. Same 14, I checked. Your turnover is almost zero. You do free tire changes for elderly residents in the neighborhood. I found that in a local paper from 2 years ago. And the building itself, she paused. Some things are worth more standing than they are as square footage. Daniel looked out the window for a moment. When he looked back, his expression was careful. Not closed, but careful. You're telling me this because you think I need to know. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know. And because if I'm going to ask for something, I believe in saying so directly. What are you asking for? Not what you think. She leaned forward slightly. I'm not here to offer you money for your building. I'm here because I think you're building something worth building. And I think it could be something more. And I've spent the last week trying to figure out how to say that without it sounding like what it probably sounds like. Which is, like a rich woman who had a bad morning, decided you were her project. The silence stretched. Then Daniel made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood of one. It startled her, and she found herself surprised again, the way she'd been surprised on Friday when she'd almost smiled. Is that what this is? He asked. No, she said, but I understand if you need time to decide that for yourself. He sat back, looked at her with the same considered steadiness she'd noticed that first morning, the quality of real attention. There's a family a few blocks from the shop, he said after a moment. Vasquez family. 3 kids. The oldest is 16 and he comes in on Saturdays and helps me in the shop. I don't pay him. His parents won't let me. Too proud. But I let him work and I teach him. He's gifted. Genuinely gifted with engines. The kind of instinct you can't train. A pause. If that building becomes a residential complex, where does he go? Where does that kind of learning happen? Evelyn didn't look away. I know. Do you? I didn't, she said honestly. I'm starting to. He looked down at his hands, those calloused, scarred hands that had been under engines and across handshakes, and once, recently, flat on a diner table while he told 2 boys to apologize. My dad used to say that a garage was a democratic institution, he said. Rich car, poor car, they all need the same things. And whoever brings it in, doesn't matter who they are, what they look like, how much money they have, you treat them right, and you do the work right, and you send them away better than they came. A beat. He wasn't a complicated man, my dad, but he understood something that takes some people their whole life to figure out. What's that? Daniel looked up. That what you build is less important than how you treat the people standing next to it while you're building. The words landed in the middle of the table between them, quiet and exact. Evelyn felt them. She felt them in the specific way she felt things that were true and that she'd needed to hear and hadn't known she'd needed until the moment they arrived. She felt them the way you felt a window opening in a room you didn't realize was airless. She didn't say anything for a moment. She let the words sit where they'd landed. I want to offer you something, she said. Not a buyout, not a development deal. A partnership. On your terms, structured around what you want the business to become. She reached into her bag and put a single business card on the table. Not the standard Ward Industries card her assistant printed by the 1,000. A plain card, her direct number handwritten on the back. There's no pressure attached to that. You can call me or not, but I wanted you to have it. Daniel looked at the card for a moment without picking it up. Why me? He asked. Because you stood up, she said simply. When you didn't have to. When it cost you nothing to stay sitting and everything to get up. She paused. I've been in business for 14 years. I've met 1,000 people who would have stayed sitting. You're the first one I've met in a while who didn't. He picked up the card. He turned it over once, looked at the handwritten number, and set it flat on the table in front of him. I have a question, he said. Go ahead. The boys, Tuesday morning, after they left. He paused. Did anyone else come over? Anyone in the diner say anything to you? She looked at him. No. He nodded slowly. That bothers me more than what they did. Why? Because they were kids. Cruel kids, yeah, but kids. That's fixable. He met her eyes. The people who sat there and watched and didn't move, those were adults. People who knew better and chose different. He shook his head once. That's a harder problem. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she said. It is. So, whatever you're asking me to be part of, he tapped the card lightly with one finger. If it's going to mean something, it can't just be about the business. It has to be about the block, the neighborhood, the Vasquez kid and the family 2 streets over who've been there for 30 years and don't know if they're getting pushed out next spring. He looked at her evenly. If you're serious, that's what serious looks like. She held his gaze. Something in her chest, the thing that had been tight since she read his property file, since she'd written what remains on a legal pad and stared at it, loosened, very slightly. The way something loosens when it finally finds what it was looking for. I know, she said. You keep saying that. Because I mean it a little more each time. He was quiet. Then he picked up her card and slid it into his shirt pocket, and he looked out the window at the street for a moment. The street where his father had built something, and he had kept it standing, and a 16-year-old kid named Vasquez came on Saturdays to learn what hands could do. Tuesday's good for me, he said. After 6. I can come to your office. Tuesday after 6, she confirmed. And bring coffee, he said. Good coffee, not the stuff you get at those corporate machines. She almost smiled again. She was doing that more lately. She hadn't decided yet how she felt about it. I'll find somewhere decent. I'll know if you don't. I don't doubt that. She put on her coat. She stood, settled her crutches, and looked down at him for a moment in the way she looked at things she was trying to see clearly. Not over, not around, but straight at. Thank you, she said, for Tuesday. I should have said it sooner. You said it fine, he replied. She moved through the diner toward the door, and he watched her go. The forward momentum, the purposeful rhythm, the absolute refusal to look like she was anything other than exactly where she intended to be. He thought about Sophie, the way he always thought about Sophie when something happened that he wanted her to understand one day. The way he filed moments like these and carried them forward. He picked up his coffee. It had gone a little cold. He drank it anyway and thought about Tuesday. He showed up at 6:02. Evelyn knew this because she'd been watching the clock, in the way she watched clocks when she was pretending not to watch them. Peripheral. Deliberate. The small performance of not caring that only worked if nobody was looking. Margaret had gone home at 5:30. The office was quiet in the way offices went quiet after hours. All the ambient hum of other people's work fading out until the building felt large and hollow around her. She heard the elevator. She heard it open, and then footsteps. Unhurried, no nonsense. The kind of footsteps that moved through unfamiliar spaces without apologizing for being there. He appeared in the glass doorway of her office and stopped for a half-second, taking it in the way he took everything in. Quick, practical assessment, then forward. Nice view, he said, and it didn't sound like a compliment to the building so much as an observation about what she could see from up here. The whole city, all of it, laid out like something she owned. Coffee's on the table, she said. Local place on 5th. The woman who runs it roasts her own beans. He picked up the cup, took a sip, and nodded once. That's real coffee. I told you I'd find somewhere decent. You did. He sat down across from her, Not the chair directly in front of her desk, she noticed, but the one angled slightly to the side, the one that positioned them adjacent rather than opposite. She filed that away. Most people who sat across from her chose the adversarial geometry automatically, like sitting across a desk was the only grammar they knew for a meeting. He'd done it differently, without appearing to think about it. She pushed a folder across the table toward him. He didn't open it right away. He looked at it, then at her. "Tell me what's in it," he said. "Preliminary partnership structure. Not a proposal, more of a framework. Something to look at and argue with." She kept her voice level. "I want you to argue with it. That's the point." He nodded and opened the folder. She watched him read. He read the way he listened, fully, without performing comprehension, moving through the pages at the pace of someone who was actually processing, rather than scanning for the headline. When he got to the third page, he stopped and read something twice. Then he looked up. "You want to make the garage an anchor tenant in the corridor plan?"
Yes.
Meaning, instead of redeveloping the block, you build around it and in partnership with it. There are 2 vacant lots within 100 yards of your building that we own outright. The plan I'm proposing builds mixed use on those, retail, housing, but treats the existing small businesses as the core of the neighborhood identity, rather than obstacles to it. She leaned forward slightly. Your garage stays. The Vasquez kid keeps his Saturdays. And the families who've been on that block for 30 years aren't looking at a displacement notice in the spring. He looked back down at the folder, turned to the 4th page. "This number," he said, pointing without looking up. "This is what you're projecting as the value add to Ward Industries if the corridor plan succeeds this way?" "Yes." "It's less than the original redevelopment projection." "By about 12%, yes." "And your board approved this?" "I haven't taken it to the board yet." He looked up. "I wanted to talk to you first," she said, "before I made any formal moves internally. Because if you're not interested, or if the terms don't work, the rest of it doesn't matter." A pause. "I don't bring people something finished and ask them to sign it. That's not a partnership. That's an acquisition with extra steps." He sat back, still holding the folder. "How many people have you done real partnerships with? Not acquisitions, not investment deals. Actual partnerships, where someone had equal standing." She held his gaze. "Not many." "How many is not many?" 2. In 14 years. She said it evenly, without embarrassment. "I'm better at building than sharing. I know that about myself." "At least you know it." "Knowing it and being past it aren't the same thing," she said. "But knowing it is where you start." He set the folder on the table and picked up his coffee again, and for a moment he was quiet. Not the uncertain quiet of someone stalling, but the considered quiet of someone thinking something through to its actual end before speaking. "I need to tell you something," he said finally. "All right?" "When I looked you up, after the first Friday at the diner, I didn't just read the Forbes profile." He looked at her directly. "I read about the East Side Corridor plan, the version that was in the city planning documents, public record." A beat. "I knew before I came in tonight that Carter's Auto was on your acquisition list." Evelyn was still. "I've known for a week," he said. "I wanted to see if you'd tell me yourself." The silence between them was different now, charged, very slightly, the way air charged before weather. "And?" she said. "And you told me." He held her gaze. "First thing. Didn't wait for me to bring it up, didn't bury it on page 4 of the framework." The corner of his mouth moved. That counted for something. She let out a slow breath. "I almost didn't tell you first." "What changed your mind?" "Something you said, about what you build being less important than how you treat the people standing next to it." She paused. I've been thinking about that all week. He nodded. Not a victory nod, just acknowledgement. The way he nodded when something landed the way it was supposed to. Okay, he said. Tell me what you actually need from me. Not the framework, just say it directly. I need your credibility, she said. I can put money into that corridor. I can put architects and planners and development managers. I can put resources behind every family on that block who needs help staying there. But I can't walk into that community and have it mean anything. Not as who I am. She paused. You've been there for 5 years. Your father was there for 30 before that. When you say something matters, people listen. When I say it, they wonder what I want. What do you want? I want to build something that works, she said. Something that's still standing in 30 years and still means something to the people around it. She looked at him steadily. I've spent 14 years building things that were profitable. I'd like to try, once, building something that was also right. He was quiet for a long time. From somewhere in the building, a cleaning cart moved down a hallway. The soft roll of wheels, the faint clatter of supplies. The city hummed beyond the glass, indifferent and constant. Sophie asked me last night where I was going tonight, Daniel said. I told her I had a meeting. She asked who with. I said a businesswoman named Evelyn. She asked what kind of businesswoman. He looked down at the folder. I said the kind who's trying to figure something out. Is that what you think I am? I think you've been very successful at the thing you built, he said carefully. And I think somewhere along the way, you started to wonder if success and rightness were the same thing. And I think the answer came back, no. And I think you're not sure what to do with that. He looked at her. Am I wrong? She held his gaze for a full 4 seconds before she answered. No, she said. You're not wrong. That's not a bad place to be, he said. Uncomfortable, but not bad. It means something's still working. He tapped the folder. I'll take this home. Read it properly. I want to show it to someone who knows commercial real estate, not your people, someone I trust. And I want to know what the exit looks like if this goes sideways. Because it might go sideways. Things do. It might, she agreed. And if it does, the people on that block can't be the ones who pay for it. Agreed. That's non-negotiable on my end, too. Put it in writing. Already on page 6. He almost smiled. All right. He stood, picked up his coffee. I'll call you Thursday. I'll be here. He started toward the door and then stopped, turned back. The woman in the diner, the waitress who brought you the milkshake. Evelyn blinked. Linda. You know her name. I've been going there for 3 weeks. Yes, I know her name. He nodded like that confirmed something. Is she in the corridor plan? Her building? Evelyn paused. Rusty's Diner is 3 blocks east of the development boundary. For now. She looked at him. For now, she conceded. Think about that, he said. And then he was gone. Footsteps down the hallway, the elevator, and then the building swallowed the sound of him, and she was alone with the folder and the city and the cooling coffee. She thought about Linda, the red hair and the expression of unimpressed experience. On the house, honey. She pulled her laptop toward her and opened the corridor plan map and looked at it for a long time. Then she saved a note on the file. Expand eastern boundary. Assessment needed. She closed the laptop. She was getting better at this. Slowly. The way you got better at things that didn't come naturally, with friction and intention and the particular discomfort of noticing how long you'd been doing something the wrong way. Thursday came. He called at 6:15. I showed the framework to Ray Dominguez, he said. Ray was a name she didn't know. She made a note to find out who he was. He's been doing commercial real estate law in this city for 20 years. He found 3 clauses he'd rewrite, and one that he said was actually fair to the point of being unusual. Which one? The community veto provision. The part where neighborhood stakeholders can block development proposals that conflict with preservation criteria. He paused. Ray said in 20 years he's never seen a developer put that in a partnership agreement voluntarily. I've never been a developer who lived 12% below projection voluntarily either, she said. There's a first time for everything. A beat of silence. You understand that provision could be used against you. If the community decides they don't like something Ward Industries wants to do down the line, I know what I wrote. I just want to make sure. Daniel, her voice was quiet but absolute. I know what I wrote. I meant it when I wrote it. If I didn't mean it, I wouldn't have written it. And if I wrote it and didn't mean it, I wouldn't deserve the partnership. A pause. The provision stays. Another silence, different from the last. She was beginning to learn his silences. Which ones were doubt? Which ones were thinking? Which ones were the kind of pause a man took when something settled into place inside him? This was the third kind. Okay, he said. I'm in. Conditionally. I want to sit with my staff before anything is signed. The 14 people who work for me have been there longer than I have in some cases. They don't find out about this from a piece of paper. They find out from me, face to face, with time to ask questions. Of course. I want to do that Friday. You're welcome to come. She hesitated. To the shop. To the shop. If you want to understand what you're partnering with, you should see it. Not a presentation deck. The real thing. He paused. Wear something you don't mind getting dirty. She looked down at herself. The silk blouse, the dark trousers, the measured armor of a woman who'd spent 14 years making sure no one doubted whether she belonged in the room. She thought about what it would mean to walk into a 12-bay garage on a November morning in sensible shoes and introduce herself to 14 people whose jobs she could have erased with a single signature 8 months ago. I'll be there at 9, she said. She was there at 8:55. The shop was already fully alive when she pushed the door open. Engines running, the clang of metal, the complex layered smell of oil and rubber, and something underneath that she couldn't name but recognized somehow as the smell of honest work. She stood in the entrance with her crutches and looked at it, and the first person she saw was a teenage boy with dark eyes and a shop rag in his hand, who was watching her from underneath a truck with the open curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned that curiosity was supposed to be concealed. "You're the lady from Ward Industries," he said. "I am. Mr. Carter said you were coming." He slid out from under the truck and stood up. 16, maybe, with the posture of someone who'd already learned how to stand straight. "I'm Marco." Marco Vasquez. She knew that name. She put her hand out. He wiped his on the shop rag first and then shook it. A firm, serious handshake, the kind someone had taught him. "I know who you are, too," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite surprise, more like the quiet recalibration of someone who'd assumed he was invisible and has just been seen. "Mr. Carter told you about me?" "He told me about a 16-year-old with a gift for engines." She met his eyes evenly. "He said instinct like that isn't something you can train." He meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. Marco was still for a moment. Then something in his chest rose. She could see it. The slow lift of a young person who has just received something they didn't know they needed. He didn't say anything, but he nodded once, careful and serious, and turned back toward the truck. Daniel appeared from the office at the far end of the shop. He had a coffee in each hand, and the look on his face that she was coming to recognize. The look of a man who had set something in motion and was watching to see where it landed. "You met Marco," he said, handing her a coffee.
We introduced ourselves.
"Good." He looked at her crutches, then at the concrete floor. "You okay on this surface?" "I'm okay on any surface," she said. Not sharp, just matter of fact, the way she said most things about herself. "I know," he said. "I'm asking anyway." She looked at him. "Yes, I'm fine." "Good." He turned toward the shop floor. "Come on, I'll introduce you." What happened in the next 40 minutes was something Evelyn would think about for a long time afterward. In the specific way she thought about experiences that rearranged something inside her. Daniel gathered his staff, mechanics, a parts manager, a young woman named Carla who handled the books and the scheduling and approximately everything else. And he told them directly, in plain language, with no corporate translation layer, what was being discussed and why, and what it might mean for all of them. He didn't minimize the history. He told them about the acquisition letter, the one from September, the one from Evelyn's subsidiary that none of them had known came from Ward Industries. He told them what the original corridor plan would have meant for the building. He watched their faces go through the specific sequence of a sucker punch. The first shock, then the anger, then the slow, deliberate settling back into attention. And then he told them about the alternative. And he told them about Evelyn. Not the Forbes profile version, not the billionaire with the crutches version, the version he knew. The woman who'd sat in a diner on a November morning and been treated like furniture and held herself together with both hands, and who had shown up the next Friday and asked hard questions and listened to the answers with the whole of her attention. The woman who'd put a community veto provision in a partnership contract because she'd decided, somewhere along the way, that being right mattered more than being comfortable. When he was done, the shop was quiet. Then a man named Walt, 22 years at Carter's Auto, a big, quiet man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, looked at Evelyn and asked, "Why didn't you just knock it down?" She held his gaze. "Because I met someone who reminded me what standing things were for." Walt looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his coffee. "Fair enough," Walt said. Carla raised her hand. "What happens if this goes sideways? What happens to our jobs?" Evelyn answered before Daniel could. She answered from page 6 of the framework, the non-negotiable clause, the one written in the language of intention rather than protection. Employment continuity. Transition support. The specific commitments she'd made in writing because Daniel had asked her to put it there, and she'd meant it enough to write it clearly. When she was done, Carla nodded. Not enthusiastic, cautious, measured. The nod of a woman who'd been burned before and had developed a healthy skepticism of promises. But present. The questions kept coming. She answered all of them. She answered some of them with, "I don't know, but I'll find out." Because that was the true answer, and the true answer was better than a smooth one. After, when the staff had gone back to work, and Marco had disappeared under the truck again, and the shop noise had resumed, Daniel stood beside her near the office door, and looked out at his people working. "How'd you do?" he asked. "Ask them, not me." "I'm asking you." She was quiet for a moment. "I think I answered the questions well. I think earning what the answers implied is going to take longer." She looked at him. "You're trusting me with something that matters to you." "Yes." "I know what that costs." "Do you?" She thought about 14 years of never trusting anyone with anything that mattered to her. About the specific arithmetic of protection, how much you kept safe by never letting go, and what the interest rate was on that kind of saving. "I'm starting to," she said. He nodded, looked back at the shop. Walt was arguing with another mechanic about the correct torque on something Evelyn couldn't identify. The argument warm and familiar. The argument of men who'd been having the same one for years and didn't particularly want to resolve it. My dad used to argue with Walt about that exact bolt, Daniel said quietly. Every single time. She looked at him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The partnership agreement was signed on a Wednesday morning in December, 3 weeks after the meeting at the shop. Not in Evelyn's office, not in a conference room with her team arranged on one side and his lawyer on the other, and the whole theater of a formal closing. Daniel had suggested the diner, and she'd said yes before he finished the sentence. And so they signed it in a corner booth at Rusty's, with Linda refilling their coffee without being asked, and the old man in the flannel jacket reading his newspaper at the counter, like the world hadn't shifted an inch. She signed first, slid it across the table. He read the last page once more. She'd learned by now that he always read the last page one more time, a habit she'd come to find steadying rather than tedious. And then he signed. And that was that. No applause, no handshake photograph. Just two people in a diner booth, and a document that meant something, and the particular quiet of a thing being done. "My board has questions," Evelyn said, when Linda had taken the cups away and replaced them with fresh ones. "I figured. 3 of them think I've lost my mind. Grant Holloway sent me a 6-page memo about projected return on investment that was the most politely furious document I've ever received." Daniel's mouth moved. "What did you write back?" "I told him to revise the corridor projections with the new development parameters and have them to me by Friday." She paused. "And I told him that if he wanted to discuss the philosophy of the decision, we could do that, but that the decision itself was not on the table." "How did that land?" "About as well as you'd expect." She turned her coffee mug. "He's a good man, Grant. He built the corridor plan from scratch and he believes in it. He just built it without asking who was already there." She looked out the window for a moment. "That's the part I should have caught earlier. That's on me." "You caught it." "Late. Still counts." She looked at him. "You're very forgiving of late arrivals." "I'm a mechanic," he said. "Half the cars I see have been ignored for a year before someone brings them in. The other half come in the day the light goes on. I fix both." A slight shrug. "Late is better than never. Never can't be fixed." She thought about that for a moment. The specific weight of it, the way things he said tended to settle rather than glance off. She'd known people her whole life who were intelligent, who were articulate, who could construct an argument with the precision of a legal brief. She'd known very few who said things the way Daniel Carter said them. Without architecture, without effort, with the simple velocity of someone who'd arrived at what they actually believed and had no particular investment in decorating it. "The board meeting is next Thursday," she said. "I'd like you there." He looked at her. "You want me in the room?" "I want you in the room." "Evelyn." He said her name the way he said things that required patience. Carefully, not unkindly. "I'm a mechanic from Meridian Street. Your board members are going to have to understand what they're looking at," she said. "And they'll understand it faster from you than from a slide deck." A pause. "You don't have to perform anything. You don't have to be anyone other than who you are. In fact, if you tried to be anyone other than who you are in that room, it would defeat the entire purpose of having you there." He was quiet. "You know what you're building," she said. "You've been building it for 5 years. You know what it costs, and what it's worth, and what it means to the people around it. I need that in the room on Thursday, and I need it coming from the person
who built it. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to testify. I'm asking you to tell the truth. You're good at that. He looked down at his coffee. When he looked up, his expression had the particular quality of a man deciding something. What time? 2:00. I'll need to shift some things at the shop. I know. I'm asking anyway. The corner of his mouth moved. All right, 2:00. He was there at 1:55, which she'd expected. He was wearing the same work boots, dark jeans without the oil stain this time, a button-down shirt in dark blue that looked like it had been pressed by someone who took pressing seriously. He looked exactly like himself, which was exactly what she'd wanted. Margaret met him at the elevator and walked him to the conference room. And when Evelyn came in 2 minutes later, she found him standing at the window looking at the city with the same expression he'd had the first time. Not impressed exactly. Assessing. Taking it in. How are you doing? She asked. Fine. He turned. Your assistant offered me coffee. The corporate machine kind. I'm sorry. I survived. He looked at the conference table. 12 chairs, polished wood, the specific geometry of institutional authority. How many board members? 7 voting members. Grant will be there too, and my CFO. 9 total. He nodded. Any of them going to be hostile? 2, possibly 3. Howard Chen is the most vocal. He's been with the board 12 years, and he doesn't like surprises. He'll push on the return projections. She paused. Let me handle Howard. And the others? Skeptical but open. They trust the financials long term. They just need to understand the rationale. She looked at him. Let them ask you questions. Answer them the way you talk to me. Don't simplify. Don't inflate. Just talk. You know you're describing what regular conversation is. I know. You'd be surprised how rare it is in that room. The board members filed in over the next 10 minutes. Evelyn watched Daniel as they arrived. He stood when they entered, shook hands, met eyes without aggression or deference. Howard Chen was a compact man in his 60s, with the bearing of someone who'd been the smartest person in most rooms he'd entered, and had stopped finding it interesting. He shook Daniel's hand and looked at him with an expression that was professionally blank and personally doubtful. Mr. Carter, he said. Mr. Chen, even, present, not performing anything. They sat down. Evelyn walked the board through the revised corridor plan in 18 minutes. She knew it cold. The numbers, the projections, the alternative development scenarios, the comparative analysis. She presented it without apology and without excessive explanation. Because excessive explanation was what you did when you weren't sure of something. And she was sure of this. When she finished, Howard Chen leaned forward. The original projection showed a return of 19% over 7 years, he said. The revised plan shows 17.2. That's an 8% reduction in projected return, Evelyn. On a development this size, that's not a rounding error. No, she agreed. It isn't. So, walk me through the logic. The logic is that the original plan would have displaced 14 established businesses and approximately 60 families in the first development phase, she said. The community opposition alone would have cost us 2 to 4 years in delays, legal challenges, and city council friction, which, when you model it properly, actually brings the real-world return on the original plan below 17%. We were comparing a paper number against a real one. Howard looked at his own copy of the projections. He didn't argue the math, because the math was correct, and he knew it. He shifted. The community veto provision. That's the clause I can't get past. We're giving stakeholders the right to block our own development decisions. We're giving stakeholders the right to flag conflicts with preservation criteria, Evelyn said, which only activates if we propose something that violates the terms of the partnership framework.
which means if we want to develop in a direction that's profitable, but the neighborhood doesn't like, then we have a conversation instead of a lawsuit, she said. Yes, Howard sat back. He looked at Daniel. Mr. Carter, you're the community anchor this provision is built around. If I'm reading this correctly, you'd have significant influence over what we can and can't do on that corridor going forward. Daniel met his eyes. That's what the document says. Doesn't that concern you? We're a $400 million company. You're a 12-bay garage. I'm a 12-bay garage that's been on that block for 50 years, Daniel said. His voice was level, unhurried. My father knew every family on Meridian Street by name. I know their kids. I know which ones are struggling, and which ones are holding on, and which ones have been waiting 2 years to find out if they're getting pushed out so a development company can put in another mixed-use complex that looks great in a brochure and means nothing to anyone who actually lives there. He paused. So, does the size difference concern me? No, because this isn't about size. It's about whether the people making decisions actually know what they're deciding about. Silence around the table. Howard Chen looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not concession, not quite, but the shift of a man who had challenged something, expecting it to yield, and found it didn't. You've done this before, Howard said. Spoken in rooms like this. Never, Daniel said. But I've talked to people my whole life. Rooms don't change the conversation. Something happened at that table that Evelyn would describe later to Margaret as the moment the temperature changed. Not dramatically, not with any single thing anyone said, but the quality of attention in the room shifted, away from doubt, towards something harder to name. The particular gravity of a person who says what they mean and means what they say, in a space where that was rarer than it should have been. The questions continued for another 40 minutes. Daniel answered each one. He was wrong once, a zoning detail he didn't know, and said so directly, and asked Evelyn to clarify, and she did. He was precise where he had precision, and honest where he didn't. By the end, even Howard's questions had changed character. They'd stopped being challenges and started being genuine inquiry, which was a different thing entirely. When it was over and the board members were filing out, Howard Chen stopped beside Daniel at the door. The Vasquez boy, he said. The 16-year-old you mentioned. Marco, Daniel said. Is he still working with you? Every Saturday. Howard was quiet for a moment. My father ran an auto shop, he said, in Queens. I learned to change my first oil at 14. He looked at Daniel with an expression that had lost most of its professional blankness. I haven't thought about that shop in a long time. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded once and walked out. Daniel looked at Evelyn. That counted for something, she said quietly. Yeah, he said. I think it did. The corridor project broke ground in late February. Not with a press event, not with a ribbon and a podium and a row of people in hard hats who wouldn't touch an actual shovel. Evelyn had suggested skipping the ceremony entirely, and Daniel had agreed immediately. And so the first morning of work on the 2 vacant lots came and went without announcement, noted only by the residents of the block who stepped out of their doors and saw the equipment and understood that whatever was coming, it wasn't the thing they'd been afraid of. Mrs. Reyes from the flower shop 2 doors down from Carter's Auto brought a plate of tamales to the construction foreman on the 3rd day. The foreman, a man named Bill who had been in construction for 30 years and had never once received tamales on a job site, ate 4 of them and reported back to Evelyn's project manager that the neighborhood was, in his professional estimation, cautiously on board.
cautiously on board, Daniel told Evelyn when she relayed this. That's probably the best we could have hoped for. Better than furious and litigating, she said. They were in the habit now of meeting once a week, sometimes at the diner, sometimes at the shop, sometimes in her office when the agenda required it. The meetings had an easy quality she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure what to do with. The ease of people who had agreed to be honest with each other and found it required less effort than they'd assumed. It was at one of these meetings, in the third week of February, that Daniel told her about the expansion. He'd been thinking about it for a while, he said. The shop had a waiting list now, 3 weeks out for anything beyond standard maintenance, a direct result of the corridor development bringing new traffic to the block. He had 2 bays sitting underused because he didn't have the staff to run them efficiently. He'd been looking at a space 2 blocks north, a building that had been empty for 8 months, that could function as an overflow facility. The kind of space where Marco Vasquez and 2 or 3 others like him could work under supervision while they built their hours towards certification. A training facility, Evelyn said. I hate that word. Makes it sound like a program. He shook his head. It's a shop, where people learn by doing, the way my dad taught me, the way I'm teaching Marco. The difference is there's a structure around it now. Credentials. A path forward. She looked at him across the table. How much? I don't want your money for this one. She blinked. Daniel, I want a loan. Real terms, real interest, structured like a business deal. Not a gift, not a grant, not a favor. He held her gaze. I've been thinking about what this partnership looks like 5 years from now, 10 years, and I need it to stand on its own legs or it doesn't stand at all. The training shop is mine. I'll build it the way I built the garage. Slowly, correctly, without owing anyone something I can't repay. She was quiet for a moment. You could apply for a city grant. The Workforce Development Fund has... I know. I looked. He paused. And I might do that later. But the first money I put into it should be mine. That's how my dad did it, and it's how I want to do it. He looked at her. You understand that? She did understand it. She understood it in the specific way you understood things, that mirrored something you'd lived yourself. The particular importance, when you were building something from the ground up, of knowing that the foundation was yours. That no one could pull it, because no one owned it. I'll connect you with someone at my bank, she said. Not Ward Industries, a personal connection. Someone who'll give you a fair look. That's all I'm asking. She wrote her name on a card and slid it across the table. He took it the same way he'd taken her number that first morning in the diner. Held it, looked at it, put it where it wouldn't get lost. It was 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning at Rusty's, that Sophie came in. She was 8 years old, and she was wearing a backpack with a horse on it, and she had Daniel's eyes, and a directness that was entirely her own. She appeared at the edge of their booth before either of them heard the door, and she looked at Evelyn with the frank, unself-conscious assessment of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend she wasn't looking. You're Evelyn, she said. I am, Evelyn said. Dad says you're his partner. I am that too. Sophie considered this. She slid into the booth next to her father with the easy proprietary confidence of someone who had sat in this booth 100 times. He talks about you at dinner sometimes, she said. Daniel put his hand over his eyes briefly. Sophie. What? She should know. Sophie looked back at Evelyn. He said you're the smartest business person he's ever met. He said you also used to not listen very well, but you're getting better. Evelyn looked at Daniel. You said that. His hand was still partially covering his face. I said something in that vicinity, yes. He also said you're brave, Sophie added, with the authority of someone presenting evidence. Because it's hard to change the way you think about things when you're a grown-up. He says most grown-ups stop trying. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She looked at this 8-year-old girl with a horse backpack and the unfiltered honesty, and felt something move inside her that she didn't have a ready category for. Not sentiment exactly. Not the warm blur of feeling that people described when they talked about being moved. Something more precise than that. The specific sensation of being seen clearly and found, against expectation, acceptable. "Your dad's right," she said. "It is hard." "Are you trying?" "Every day." Sophie nodded seriously. "Good." She picked up a menu. "Can I have pancakes?" "You had breakfast," Daniel said. "That was an hour ago." "That's not how time works." "It is if you're 8. Linda appeared at the table with the expression of a woman who had raised children and recognized the specific logic of this argument. She set down a short stack of pancakes in front of Sophie without a word and moved on. Daniel stared at the pancakes. "How did she—" "She's a professional," Evelyn said. "I'm going to end up paying for those." "Probably." Evelyn looked at Sophie cutting her pancakes with careful precision and felt the almost smile come again. Easier now, more familiar, less surprising than it used to be. "She's remarkable," she said, quietly, not for Sophie to hear. Daniel looked at his daughter. The warmth moved across his face the way it always did when Sophie was involved. Unguarded, automatic, the specific love of a parent who had built their whole idea of what mattered around a single person. "Yeah," he said. "Just that. Yeah." Outside, February was trying to become March without fully committing. The city moved past the windows in its perpetual forward motion, indifferent to small moments in diner booths, to the specific weight of things being built slowly and correctly, to the arithmetic of what it cost to stand up and what came from standing. Inside, Sophie ate her pancakes. Daniel drank his coffee. Evelyn sat with her hands around her mug and thought about what Walt had said at the shop meeting. Fair enough. And about Howard Chen and his father's garage in Queens. And about a plate of tamales handed to a construction foreman on a February morning by a woman who'd lived on the same block for 30 years and was still there. She thought about what remained. She was beginning to understand it wasn't a question anymore. It was a project. The most important one she'd ever taken on, and the only one she'd ever built with someone else beside her, and the only one that felt, from the inside, like something worth waking up for. She didn't say any of that. She just drank her coffee and watched Sophie explain to Daniel, with great seriousness, why marine biology was probably still her career of choice, and felt the specific warmth of a life rearranging itself around something true. The training shop opened on a Thursday in April, which was not a day anyone had planned for, but turned out to be the right one anyway. Daniel had been aiming for the first Monday of the month. Clean, symbolic, the kind of date that looked good when you told the story later. But the permits came through on a Wednesday. The equipment was delivered and installed by Thursday morning, and Marco Vasquez showed up at 6:30 a.m. with 2 of his cousins and a hand-painted sign that read, "Carter Technical," in block letters on a piece of plywood. And Daniel had looked at the sign and looked at the 3 teenagers standing there in the cold April air and decided that waiting until Monday was the wrong kind of patience. He called Evelyn at 7. "It's open," he said. She was quiet for a second. "Today?" Marco made a sign. Another pause. "I'll be there at 9. She was there at 8:45. She came through the door and stopped and looked at the space, the clean bays, the new lifts, the workbenches along the far wall where Marco was already elbow-deep in a training engine, explaining something to his cousin with the easy authority of someone who'd been waiting his whole life for someone to ask. She stood there with her crutches, and she looked at all of it, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. Daniel came up beside her. Well, it's real, she said. It's been real for a while. I know. She looked at him. But there's a difference between something being real in a document and real in the world. He understood that. He'd felt it himself, standing in the empty space 2 weeks ago before the equipment arrived, trying to see it the way his father might have seen it. Not the potential, but the thing itself. The bays and the lifts and the workbenches, the specific realness of a thing you'd built from nothing and could now walk through. My dad would have had a lot of opinions about the lift configuration, he said. Good opinions or bad ones? Loud ones. He almost smiled. He had a very specific way he thought things should be arranged. Didn't always match the manual, but it always made sense once he explained it. He paused. I kept some of it. The way he organized the hand tools, the sequencing on the diagnostic station, the parts I understood. She looked at him. And the parts you didn't? I kept those too. I figure I'll understand them eventually. She thought about that. About inherited things. The ones you carried forward on purpose. And the ones you carried forward because they were simply in you. Because the people who came before you had put them there without asking. And you only found them when you needed them. Evelyn. His voice shifted, just slightly. The quality that meant he was saying something he'd been carrying for a while. I want to tell you something. All right. When my dad died, when I took over the shop, I spent the first year convinced I was going to lose it. He looked straight ahead at the shop floor, not at her. Not because the business was failing, because I kept waiting for the moment when it became clear that I wasn't him, that I couldn't hold it the way he held it. He paused. That feeling doesn't go away completely, but it got smaller. The more I did the work, the more I just did the actual work, the smaller it got. He turned to look at her. I think you've been carrying something like that. She held his gaze. She didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. The accident, she said finally. After it happened, after the surgeries, after the rehab, I built Ward Industries partly because I needed to prove something. To the driver who walked away. To every person who'd ever looked at my crutches first. She paused. And I proved it. I proved it 17 ways over 14 years. And at some point in the last few years, I realized I was still proving it. Still building for the same reason. And the reason had been wrong from the start. She looked down at her hands. You can build the right thing for the wrong reason for a long time before the building starts to feel hollow. He was quiet. That morning at the diner, she said, those boys. People ask me sometimes, people who've heard the story, Margaret, a few others. They ask why it hit me so hard. I've dealt with worse. I have. I've been in rooms where men talked over me for an hour, and I walked out and closed a deal and never flinched. She looked at the shop floor, at Marco and his cousins, at the Thursday morning light coming through the high windows. But that morning I was tired. I was sitting in a diner because I'd finally admitted I was tired. And something about being that tired, in that specific moment, I think it was the closest I'd come in years to just being a person. Not a CEO, not a case study, not a point to be proved. Just a person, in a booth, with a milkshake. A beat. And that's when it happened. And then I came over, he said. Not proudly, just factually. And then you came over. She looked at him. And you didn't treat me like a CEO or a case study. You didn't treat me like someone to feel sorry for. You just asked if I was okay and made room. He was quiet for a moment. That's just how you treat people. I know, she said. That's what I mean. Marco called out from across the shop. Something about the training engine's timing belt.
A question directed at Daniel, with the comfortable demand of a student who'd stop being intimidated by asking. Daniel answered without moving, the response automatic and precise. And Marco nodded and went back to work. "He's going to be extraordinary," Evelyn said. "He already is." Daniel watched him for a moment. His parents came in last week. His mother, she cried. She kept saying thank you in a way that made it clear she wasn't just talking about the shop. He shook his head slowly. "I told her Marco was doing the work. I'm just not getting in his way." "You're more than that." "Maybe, but that's the most important part." He looked at her. Not getting in the way of what someone is already becoming. She filed that. She filed it next to all the other things he'd said that had rearranged something in her. The accumulation of them. The slow reordering of the architecture inside her that had been happening since November. She thought sometimes that she'd been a building herself all these years. Solid, load-bearing, designed for function and durability. And what the last few months had done was not tear anything down, but open windows where there had been walls. Let in air and light to rooms she'd kept sealed so long she'd forgotten they were there. The corridor project was 40% complete by the end of April. The first residential units above the new retail space on the north lot were framed and enclosed, and Grant Holloway, who had revised his projections 3 times and arrived somewhat reluctantly at the conclusion that the community-integrated approach was performing within acceptable range, had stopped sending Evelyn pointed memos and started sending her data, which was how she knew he'd accepted the new direction. Grant's moods were most clearly expressed through his choice of document format. Howard Chen came to see the site on a Friday afternoon in late April. He didn't announce he was coming. He just appeared in his good coat, standing on the sidewalk in front of Carter's Auto and looking at the construction 2 lots over, with his hands in his pockets. Daniel saw him from inside the shop and came out. "Mr. Chen." Howard turned. He didn't look surprised to be caught. "Mr. Carter." He looked back at the framing on the north lot. "How's it going?" "On schedule, 2 weeks ahead on the residential side." Evelyn's project managers are good. They are. Bill, the site foreman, brought tamales to Mrs. Reyes yesterday. She'd been bringing them to him for weeks. He finally figured out he should return the gesture. Howard looked at him. "That's not in any project report I've seen." "No," Daniel agreed. "It's not." Howard was quiet for a moment. "I owe you something," he said. "An acknowledgement. In the board meeting, I pushed back hard. My job is to push back on things that put the company at risk. But I pushed back on this one harder than the numbers justified, and I knew it at the time." He looked at Daniel with the directness of a man who didn't apologize often, and took it seriously when he did. "I looked at you, and I saw a liability before I saw a person. That was wrong." Daniel received this the way he received most things, steadily, without performing a reaction. "I've had that before." "I don't doubt it." Howard paused. "My father's shop was on a block in Queens that got redeveloped in 1987. He didn't get a call from anyone, just a letter, and then a date, and then it was gone." He looked back at the construction. "I became a developer partly because I thought if I was on the inside, I could change the way it worked. I'm not sure I ever did." A long pause. "Maybe this is how it changes." Daniel looked at him. "You could start by knowing the names of the people on the next block you develop." Howard nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "I could." He stayed for an hour. He walked the site with Daniel and asked real questions, and listened to the real answers. And before he left,
He shook Daniel's hand and held it a moment longer than a standard handshake required. Evelyn heard about it from Margaret, who heard it from the site project manager, who had apparently witnessed the entire conversation from 20 feet away while pretending to review blueprints. She called Daniel that evening.
"Howard came by," she said. "I know. What did you say to him?" "I told him to learn people's names." She laughed. Not the almost smile, not the restrained almost laugh. She laughed, genuine and sudden, and the sound surprised both of them. She recovered quickly, but not quickly enough to pretend it hadn't happened. "What?" he said, and she could hear that he was smiling. "Nothing. It's just—" She paused. "It's a very simple solution. Simple solutions are usually right." "I know. That's what I mean." There was a warmth in the quiet that followed, the comfortable quiet of two people who'd been honest with each other long enough that silence required no explanation. "Sophie wants to come to the training shop," he said. "She wants to see what Marco is learning. She's decided marine biology and automotive engineering are not mutually exclusive career paths." "She's right. Submersible vehicles require significant mechanical knowledge." "Don't tell her that. She'll take it as confirmation." "It is confirmation." "Evelyn. She should know what she's capable of." A pause. Both of them. He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said softly. "They should." The first residents moved into the North Lot building in August. 6 units, all filled by people who'd been on waiting lists. 3 families from within the corridor itself, 2 young adults who'd grown up in the neighborhood and come back. 1 older woman named Patricia, who'd been renting the same apartment 3 blocks away for 22 years and could finally afford something with a second bedroom. Patricia knocked on the door of Carter's Auto the week she moved in. She brought a loaf of banana bread wrapped in foil, and she asked for Daniel by name. And when he came out, she said, "My son's car needs new brake pads, and I heard you do good work." He brought her car in that afternoon. He did the brake pads and noticed the belts were going, and replaced those too, at cost, because that was how his father had done it, and that was how he did it. Patricia came back 3 days later with another loaf of banana bread. "You didn't have to do that," he told her. "You didn't have to do half of what you did," she said. "Here we both are." He told Evelyn that story at the diner the following Tuesday. She listened to the whole thing with her hands around her coffee, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Patricia," she said. "Patricia Moore. 64 years old, worked 30 years as a school librarian." Evelyn looked at him. "You know her name." "I know her name," he said, "and her son's name, and the fact that she makes very good banana bread." "Of course you do." He looked at her steadily. "So do you. You know Linda's name. You know Marco's name. You know Walt's argument about torque. You know Howard Chen's father had a shop in Queens." He paused. "You've always known how to pay attention. You just needed to decide it was worth it." She held his gaze. "You think that's what changed?" "I think that's most of it." He picked up his coffee. The rest was just showing up. She thought about that, about what it meant to show up, not as a concept, not as a motivation poster philosophy, but as a physical fact. Walking into a shop in November with sensible shoes and introducing yourself to 14 people whose jobs you could have erased. Sitting in a board meeting and saying out loud, in front of witnesses, "I should have caught it earlier. That's on me." Coming back to a diner on a Thursday after you'd been knocked around on a Tuesday, because it was where you'd decided to be and you were going to be there. Showing up, over and over, regardless of what it cost. It was September when they went back to the diner together. Not their usual Tuesday morning, but a Saturday, the kind of unhurried Saturday that had become possible now that the project was in a steady phase, and the shop was fully staffed, and Sophie was spending the morning at the training space watching Marco, who had become, over the course of the summer, something between a mentor figure and an older brother to her, which was a development that pleased Daniel more than he'd expected and surprised him not at all. They sat in the corner booth, his booth, the one she'd stolen that first Friday morning, the one that had become, without formal declaration, simply theirs. Linda brought coffee and a fresh strawberry milkshake without being asked, and set the milkshake in front of Evelyn with the same unimpressed efficiency she brought to everything. And when she walked away, Evelyn looked at the milkshake for a long moment. "She's been doing that since November," Daniel said.
"I know." Evelyn wrapped both hands around the glass. "She did it the morning it happened, before she even knew whether I was okay." "That's Linda. That's Linda." She looked at the diner, the counter where the old man in the flannel jacket was reading his paper, which he did every Saturday without variation. The tables full of people eating breakfast, with the comfortable inattention of people who were exactly where they were supposed to be. The bell above the door that jingled every few minutes as the Saturday crowd came and went. "I used to eat at my desk," she said, "for years. I told myself it was efficiency." "And now?" She looked at him. "Now I think I was just afraid of this." "Of a diner?" "Of being in a room full of people and being one of them. Not the CEO, not the woman with the crutches, not the case study or the cautionary tale or the success story." She paused. "Just a person in a booth having breakfast." He held her gaze with that steady attention she'd come to understand as the most valuable thing he gave. Not advice, not direction, not the confident authority of someone who had all the answers. Just full, unhurried presence. The willingness to look directly and not look away. "You're that now," he said quietly. "I'm working on it." "You're that now," he said again. Certain. Not performing certainty, just clear. The way he was clear about things that were true. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the diner window, the September city moved in its perpetual forward motion. Not indifferent anymore, or not only indifferent. Full of Patricia Moores and Marco Vasquez's and Howard Chen's, standing on sidewalks, reconsidering long-held certainties. Full of Lindas who put milkshakes on tables before anyone asked. Full of men who stood up when nobody else would. And girls with horse backpacks who thought marine biology and automotive engineering were entirely compatible life paths. Full of the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable weight of people who showed up for each other. Evelyn picked up the milkshake. She took a sip. Strawberry, cold, the one small comfort of a November morning that had become the beginning of everything. Of the partnership, and the corridor, and the training shop, and the 14 employees who weren't going anywhere, and Marco's future, and Howard Chen's reckoning, and Patricia Moore's second bedroom, and all the slow, accumulating evidence that something done right, something built honestly, something held together with attention and integrity, and the willingness to stand up when it would have been so much easier to stay sitting. That something like that grew. It didn't just hold. It grew. "Same time Tuesday?" Daniel said. She set the glass down. She almost smiled. And then she just smiled, fully, without managing it, and said, "Same time Tuesday." And that was how it stayed. Not the ending of a story, but the establishment of a rhythm, the kind that outlasted the telling of it. Two people in a corner booth, a city building itself around the choices they'd made, and the absolute certainty that some things, once they were standing, were built to remain.